Hey, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We're going to give everyone about 2 to 3 minutes to file on because as I sit here, I can see people steadily flowing in. Before we get started, just so you know, your camera's off, you're muted, so you don't have to worry about any of that. However, the chat box is open as well as the Q&A. The Q&A is specifically for live questions. However, we're not going to start the Q&A portion until towards the end, and we'll let you know when that happens. The chat box is for y'all to chat back and forth and do whatever in the world you want to do. Just keep it cordial if you can. So tonight is the State of the Wild Turkey presented by Dr. Mike Chamberlain. Obviously, very gracious of him to come on and share some of his knowledge with us. The one thing cool about where I'm at is if you notice this background at all, we've done a lot of masterclasses with the guys from Mossy Oak, and Jared and I drove up here today. We're working on some cool stuff that y'all will find out about later, but the Mossy Oak guys were super gracious enough to let us use this venue. And I know the Mossy Oak guys have done a lot of work with you, Dr. Chamberlain, but that's about all the running of the mouth that I want to do. I'd like to kick it over to you so you can talk to some of us about the wild turkey and what everyone's been interested in here lately, especially this time of month.
Yeah, for sure, Lake. What I'm going to do is go over a presentation that I gave in Nashville last week. And if you were there, I'll apologize for the redundancy, but I think it'll give us a good 15-minute little snapshot of kind of where things are with the bird, and then hopefully that'll open up a ton of questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I'm going to share my screen here and get going.
I don't think we'll have any issues begging these folks for questions. I know we turkey hunters are an inquisitive bunch, so I don't think questions are going to be short. But yeah, I'm eager for this presentation.
Yeah, so hopefully that screen looks good. So basically, what I wanted to do was kind of go through the state of the bird and give a very brief overview of where we've been. Which, if you're a younger turkey hunter, say less than 30, you may not really know. Where we are now, everybody hopefully has a pulse on that, whether it's in your back 40 or across the nation. And then talk a little bit about where we want to be. Where do we see ourselves in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years relative to the status of the bird? If you kind of go back to the 1980s and 90s, we were focused on restoration of this bird. So states were trapping and transporting birds all over the place. And the idea was, put birds in vacant habitats or in areas where the density was really low and let them do their thing. So you saw states that were basically making agreements with other states to trade. So in other words, I'll trade you 20 turkeys for some deer, or I'll trade you 30 turkeys for a couple of pronghorn. So birds were being moved all over. And what that did was it contributed to a lot of mixing at the population level, and turkeys just exploded. And we went through this phase where we were learning a lot about the bird, but what we were learning was focused on pretty generic things like, how much space do they use, and what's their survival, and what's their nest success, and that type of thing. And at the same time, you saw this just absolute explosion in the popularity of turkey hunting, particularly in the early 1990s. And that's when I started turkey hunting in the 80s, but I started spring hunting kind of in the late 80s and early 90s. And the popularity of the sport was going crazy at that time. So you kind of saw this increase in populations across the country, and you saw this increase in the popularity of the sport at the same time. And then you kind of get to the 2000s, and something was going on under our noses, and we really didn't know, even when we looked at the data, what was coming. But I'm going to show you. But our flocks were getting smaller. States had largely thought that they had reached their restoration goals, so they stopped putting money into research and they started prioritizing other species. And at the same time, we started seeing a collapse in the fur market. Populations of many predators appeared to be increasing. Survival rates of turkeys, in what few studies were ongoing, showed a picture that trends were heading downward. Nest success was lower, adult survival was lower. Meanwhile, the popularity of turkey hunting continued to explode. And we're all familiar with the tools and technology, but during the 2000s, that's when you started seeing just this incredible increase in the tools, the tricks that we have, whether it's camouflage or decoys or choke technologies and shot technologies. And all of this was going on in the 2000s. Meanwhile, there was almost no research going on turkeys. And what few projects were ongoing, again, were kind of hitting the low-hanging fruit, if you will. They were largely studying things that either had been studied before or were not super pressing questions at hand. So there was something sinister going on, and what that was this. And this figure on the right is just these are poult per hen ratios across a number of states in the South, just showing the declines through time. And if you kind of glance at that, you'll see that in many of these states, I'll just pick, for instance, North Carolina, which is dead center on the left in that figure. Restoration was ongoing in the late 1980s, yet poult per hen ratios were already starting to decline. So we were seeing production declines before restoration ever ended. And if you look at some, states like Oklahoma, there on the directly right of North Carolina, the declines were quite precipitous. And I showed this figure in 2012 at a meeting of the Turkey Technical Committee meeting. And there was fairly strong consensus across the states that something was wrong, and we just didn't know exactly what was going on, but clearly something is amiss. So let's start trying to figure out what that is. So you started seeing this ramp up in research again, and it's taken some time, and it's taken quite a few people, particularly legislators, to realize that there's something that's not clearly clicking here on all cylinders, and that prompted agencies to start reinvesting money in research. As this was ongoing, you started seeing studies that were trying to dig at a little bit more difficult questions, such as what are the influences of land management practices like prescribed fire on turkey behavior, nest success, brood survival. You started seeing a lot of work on disease issues, avian pox and proliferative viruses and things that we know are present in turkey populations, but we don't quite fully understand what effects they have. And at the same time, you started seeing continued kind of focus on turkey hunting. We were still 2012, 2013. I remember giving presentations and I would be confronted, if you will, by hunters after the presentation saying, yeah, I don't see what you're seeing here. There's no problem in my area and everything looks good. And meanwhile, if you hop on Google Earth and you spend any time scanning the Southeast and parts of the Midwest, you'll see that areas of hardwood forest have been cleared and converted to other land use practices. And wild turkeys are inextricably linked to hardwood forest. That is the primary fall and winter habitat for wild turkeys in most of their range. And it's not just a food source. Hardwoods are critical to reproduction because hens and toms that come out of the winter stressed and down on weight because they've had a poor mass crop have lower reproductive success than during years when there's a good mass crop. And that's how that functions is hens come out of the winter and they're down on body weight. And in the bird world, being fat is good. So there is hope, for us out there. It doesn't work like that necessarily in humans, but in birds, being a fat female is actually a great thing because your body condition is high and you have a lot of endogenous reserves. You have a lot of fat stored, and it allows you to be, quote unquote, a better mom. You can incubate longer, you can be more persistent, and you're more successful. So this kind of gets us down to where we are today. And where we are today is, within the past decade, research has just exploded. And in some ways, a lot of what we're doing, at least the simple part, like catching birds, hasn't really changed from the days of Lovett Williams, who was a pioneer in this field. And his picture's in the top right. And, we catch birds using pretty much the same methods, but everything else has changed. I mean, we have new ways of looking at vegetation, such as aerial photography and drones, and just incredible technology that allows us to understand vegetation structure from one day to the next, which is remarkable. We have autonomous listening devices that allow us to describe gobbling behavior to the minute. We have the development of GPS units like what's in the bottom left here, and these units, the one that's on that bird was the first prototype that we put out, and since then we now have GPS units that allow us to remotely download data. So in other words, we put this unit on the bird and we never touch he or she again. We download the data remotely from a distance, and the bird wears the unit until the straps on the harness break and it falls off, and we're getting thousands, tens of thousands of locations per bird now. Whereas when I was a grad student in the 1990s, if we got maybe 1,000 locations on an individual bird across a full year, we were really doing something. Now we get 1,000 in a week. It's pretty remarkable. So what we've learned is a few things. One, this top left is showing us, what you're looking at is two lines, and that's just nest incubation dates in 2 years in Georgia on a site. And what you see is the arrows are pointing to these peaks in incubation, and those peaks are later than we thought they were. In other words, the peaks and when most hens are on the nest is about a week and a half later on average than we believed it was based on data collected in the 1990s. And you'll also notice that line, those two lines continue all the way out into mid-July. And what this tells you is this bird's nesting across a long part of the year, and that's not a good thing. The ideal scenario would be for the bird to nest across about 60 days, hatch their clutches, and move on. And what our birds are doing across much of their range is they're taking about 4 months to get all their nesting done. And a poult that's hatched, say in that graph around June the 5th, has a really tough road ahead. Poult survival on clutches hatched that later is quite low. Some other things we're seeing is, you've got this picture on the top right. You've got some birds that are dominant to others. We've known about dominance hierarchies for decades, and in many ways we largely ignored them. But we do know that dominance matters, and it influences how birds behave. We don't know how it influences things like the use of decoys and reaping and that type of thing, which I'm sure we can get into, but there's a lot of discussion about that. This picture in the bottom left is showing a coyote chasing some hens out of a food plot. And what we've clearly seen with predators like coyotes is they may not really be that important as a predator per se, in that they kill turkeys, but they constantly harass turkeys. And there's growing evidence suggesting that harassment has indirect effects on the bird, not just mortality, but it could be increasing stress levels and causing changes to their behavior that may be problematic. So, where do we want to go from here? And I would say, if you look, research in many ways define restoration. We were moving birds everywhere. And a lot of those birds received leg bands. They received VHF telemetry units. Biologists and graduate students and researchers tracked those birds, and those data sets defined what we know about the bird. And I have to wonder, excuse me, whether research will also define the legacy of how we address what we're facing right now. And I think what you've seen is this groundswell of research as a result. As of last week, based on my calculations, there was more research being done on wild turkeys than at any time in the last 30 years. This is my 30th year studying wild turkeys, and there are by far more research projects on the ground now than there have been since I got in this game. And what I'll call it is kind of many states are knocking off the dust, if you will, shaking off the dust. I love this picture that Tess took. And what I mean by that is there's a number of states like, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, that have had long-term studies that have been ongoing for a number of years. And those studies keep plugging away at it. But you're also seeing a lot of states that are pulling out the weapons again and starting projects. And in some cases, states that either have never conducted wild turkey research, or it's been 3 or 4 decades since they conducted any research, states like Nebraska and Kentucky. And that, to me, speaks volumes about what agencies now see. They see an issue and they're prioritizing wild turkeys and the resources it takes to study them. And to me, that's a real positive. So what's the path forward? To me, it's trust the science. We trusted the science back decades ago. And when you used to walk in a room in the mid 1990s and you talk to people about the restoration of the bird, there were landowners and biologists and hunters, agencies, everybody was on the same page because the goal was to restore the bird to all portions of their historic range. And everyone had the same goal, but they had different perspectives on how to get there. That's the exact same situation we're in right now. We all have our different perspectives. We all have unique ways of thinking about it, but the bottom line is we all want the same thing. And what you're seeing now are these large, huge research projects. And when I say big, I mean multi-million-dollar projects that are cutting across state boundaries, geopolitical boundaries. And that's really a positive, because what that allows is it gives agencies more rigorous data. So in other words, I can study turkeys in Georgia all day long, but if I can take the data from Georgia and I can compare it to data from 10 other states, then I can go to the state agency here and say, this is what's going on in your state, but this is what's also going on in all of these other states. And here's all of that variation through space and time. That allows them to make better decisions. And what you're also seeing is I'll call it leave your ego at the door. You know, academics like me and researchers, we all have a healthy ego, and egos kill. So what you're seeing is this really strong push for standardization. In other words, let's all do the same thing. We all have our different objectives in these projects, but let's collect data the same. Let's measure things the same way. Let's be able to put all of the data in one pot. And you can answer your questions and I'll answer mine, but we're all going to collect the same information. And what that's allowing is for these massive data sets that we now have, thousands of birds that are all monitored the same way. All the information is collected the same on each bird. They're all stored in the same databases. And that allows all these agencies to tap into those databases, which is a lot more powerful than kind of living in a silo in your own state. And I kind of liken what's going on to this kind of football field approach. And I've used this analogy in podcasts, and if you've heard it and you don't want to hear it again, go get a refreshment, a beverage or something. But the bottom line is, there is no smoking gun here to address these challenges. You've got things that we don't understand, like, sociality, like in the top left, these things that we don't really understand how jakes and younger birds end up in a breeding population. The bottom left, we know that predation is important, but then you see pictures like this where you have a predator that's capable of killing a bird standing in an open area with those same birds. And it just speaks to how complex predation is. You've got issues with disease in the top center, where we have emerging diseases that, quite frankly, we don't understand. You have hunting that's ongoing, and we all want to hunt, and turkey hunting is very popular, but you also have to realize that turkeys are the only game bird in the lower 48 that's hunted during their breeding season. And that's unique. And what that causes is some challenges for agencies, because you're trying to kind of balance harvest with the notion that you don't want to disrupt breeding. We've seen precipitous declines in brood habitat across much of the Midwest and Southeast, like this lower right picture. And a lot of that is attributable to this picture at the very bottom, which is just declines in habitat quality. I live in the Southeast, and I can drive you to thousands of miles that look like that picture, where there's just very, very dense and poorly managed. And most turkeys live on private land. So at the end of the day, it's going to be up to all of us to encourage private landowners to make improvements to their properties. We can't simply rely on agencies, because agencies don't control the footprint of most of the states that we're seeing issues in. And I think collectively the answer is in research. We need to keep studying this bird. We need to understand these challenges. We need to understand how influential each player on that field is. And we need to be willing to work with agencies to address those issues, understanding that some of the decisions at the time may not be popular with us, but again, we all want the same thing. We all have the same collective goal. We all want sustainable populations in the future. We all have different perspectives on how to get there, but we need to take the same path that we took 30 years ago, and that's to work collectively to make these changes and make sure that we've got birds to hunt in the future.
For
And
sure.
that, let me see, I can stop sharing where you don't see this. Yep.
I know just from a turkey hunter's perspective, Dr. Chamberlain, it's interesting to hear that, you've been addressing these population issues as far back as 2012. I can only speak to it. It seems like in just recent years, it's really starting to show up as, kind of like a hot topic, but it has been pretty incredible to see, where folks are putting, listening to folks like you, and then you got brands like Mossy Oak doing the turkey stamp, conservation organizations. It's like you're seeing kind of a rally happen behind, and it seems to be behind the right things. People are pushing more research projects. Like you said, for there to be more research projects ongoing now than in, I think you said, the past 30 years, that's pretty incredible in my perspective, at least.
Yeah, honestly, some of this started before COVID, but I think if one thing came out of COVID that I think is a positive, it was that everybody was stuck on their phones and they were stuck in their houses, and they had nothing to do but go outside and communicate with each other remotely. And you saw this explosion in social media use. And I think part of this, Lake, is it just took people talking about it and realizing, hey, what they just said, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the same thing in my area. Well, okay. Well, then the next person says, you know what? I'm seeing the same issues in my back 40. And it just started perpetuating this discussion that's occurred for almost 3 years now. It's scary to think it was literally 3 years ago. That I think has been a rallying, a call to arms, if you will, that, look, folks, turkey hunters we all have, different thoughts, but we all cherish the bird and we cherish the opportunity to chase it. And we see problems in our own areas and we want to address it. We want to help. And to your point, groups like Mossy Oak and these other groups that have stepped up and put tremendous amounts of money into research, state agencies that are giving millions of dollars. And those dollars, most of my research dollars that come from state agencies are generated from us. They're generated from Pittman Robertson funds, from excise taxes on firearms and ammunition and sporting goods. And so COVID was a major bump. And that's a positive, it's a silver lining that there continues to be a swell of resource, of money there at the state level that allows these agencies the flexibility to put some money into turkey research.
Yeah. It shined a light on something that we didn't necessarily want to know about, but it's a good thing that we do know about it, because that's how all of this came about.
Yep. Yep, for sure.
To kick it over to the questions, because as you can imagine, we are getting a pile of them, and I'm going to try to address.
Yeah, I'm watching the Q&A, and yeah, I don't have enough. I don't have enough time tonight to answer all these, but I will tell you this: if there's going to be a transcript or some other way for me to address questions after we end this, I'm more than happy to do that. I know we're going to run out of time and not be able to answer everybody's questions.
For sure. The other thing that's really important to note is, there's already been a lot of information presented. When we get into these questions, there's going to be more. if you want to listen back to any of this, if you have to log off and miss some of it, don't fret. We upload all of these to the onX YouTube channel the very next day. So all of this information will be available. One of the questions that I saw frequently enough pop up as pre-registration questions and questions that came up live, a lot of folks had questions about fall hunting, as far as like, could fall hunting be an issue that is, potentially tied to one of the many effects that is causing this decline that we're noticing. Another thing that gets tied in with fall hunting is in some states you have you can legally kill hens, and so there's a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, so what we know about fall harvest is largely based on data from decades ago, and there's been a lot of work on modeling, if you will, like what effect fall harvest has. And you have to understand that models are just a simplification of reality. So my opinion and my thoughts on fall hunting are pretty simple. So there's only three things that there's only three outcomes. It could help the population, it could have no effect on the population, or it could negatively affect the population. That's really the only three outcomes. Well, I think we would all agree that it doesn't help the population. So it either has no effect or it has a negative effect, or more likely, it's somewhere in the middle there. There's always gray. And there are some states that have a very rich tradition of fall hunting. I grew up in Virginia, and Virginia still has a very rich fall hunting tradition, and I enjoyed it when I was a young person. But in areas facing declines, it doesn't seem logical to me to allow birds to be harvested during the fall if you're seeing a population decline. And you kind of have to understand that in many ways, fall seasons are a relic of what happened decades ago. Turkey populations were exploding. States were looking to give us more opportunity. There were not near as many turkey hunters as there are now. States wanted us to be able to get out and chase more things and have fun. And there were a lot of turkeys. And so they liberalized fall seasons. And now what you've seen is a lot of states scale back. Some have ended their fall season. Some have curtailed bag limits. And like my home state of Virginia has severely reduced the length of the season. The other thing to think about with fall hunting is most of the birds that are killed are juveniles. And every state's data can show you that. Most birds are juveniles. So if you look at the four, number 1 through 4, juvenile males or jakes, juvenile hens, adult hens, and then toms. That's number 1 through 4. So the bottom line is we're harvesting young birds that we're struggling to produce. And in the face of these declines in productivity that we're seeing in a lot of states, it just doesn't seem logical to me to allow us to harvest those birds in the fall, knowing that we're taking mostly birds that we struggled to produce that same summer. Now, people will criticize that statement, and I understand that because there are people that cherish fall hunting, but I think agencies are continuing to have to struggle with, okay, what do we do with fall hunting? Killing a few hundred birds across a state probably is largely irrelevant. But that's the things that agencies grapple with.
Right. The next questions I'm gonna go to kind of revolve around private land, owned land, leased land, whatever. I like going to those because, as you said, especially here in the Southeast, private land is what we mostly have. And so if we're, kind of alluded to, if we're going to see any kind of mass changes, then it's going to have to take place on private ground. So the first one of those is the question. I'm just going to read it straight off. What would your top 3 changes to make on a property to better it that is overgrown in the Southeast after logging? So basically, the picture of the poor habitat that you showed. If someone has a property, if there's top things you would do to improve it.
You have to open it up. You have to seek ways to allow the birds to see. Turkeys make a living being able to see. And that's a fundamental difference between a turkey and a deer. You know, a white-tailed deer runs into cover and hides and lets danger pass. Turkeys see danger approaching and then walk away from it. And their last resort is to fly away from it. And if they have to fly into thick cover, it benefits the predator, not the turkey. So anything you could do, prescribed burning, roller chopping, mulching, anything that you could do to take that picture that's in that slide and bring that understory down to where a bird can see over it and can see through it. That's number one. Two, what I see personally across a lot of the US is a dramatic loss of brood cover. And, you know, brood cover is lay on your stomach and look out in front of you. And that's the way a poult, a 1 week old poult perceives its world. If you can't see laying on your stomach, they can't either. And then hop up on one knee and look around you. And that's the perspective a hen has while she's standing guard over that brood. So anything you can do to create patchy mosaics of open ground, less dense cover, you have to disturb it. Turkeys are linked to disturbance, some kind of disturbance, disking, anything that you can do to take that vegetation and bring it down closer to ground level and stimulate it. That's going to help turkeys across their range.
Is there any way that somebody could offer their property up for research? I guess, you know, from hearing all these research projects going on, we don't know how those are selected, but that was a question.
Yeah. So I get this. Actually, I got an email about this today from someone. That's a tough question to answer because the research projects that we largely do are driven by the state agency. So in other words, South Carolina DNR contacts me and says, we want a research project on X, Y, and Z, and these are the areas we want the work done on. They have a priority, right? Very seldom does an agency contact somebody like me and say, well, hey, yeah, well, you pick, Mike. You know, they have an agenda for where it's priority. So if you have private lands that are adjacent to those areas, then those are valuable. And in fact, the work I have right down here, an hour from here in Georgia, private landowners are the key to our research. I mean, we can catch birds on the public lands, but these private inholdings that are often well managed, birds are flocked to those areas, and we know they're going to disperse onto the public lands. But the private landowners' graciousness to allow us to access the site and to catch birds and track birds is instrumental to the success. So I would say, if you're in a state and you know that research is ongoing, if you happen to own land anywhere around where that site is, reach out to somebody. And if you don't know who to reach out to me, and I can put you in contact with the researchers in that state. In most situations, people like me are craving properties to get access to, if for no other reason than knowing, okay, if I have a hen that goes to nest on that property, I can get access there. If I have, you know, a bird that dies on that property, I can get access to retrieve the carcass. Or great, if, hey, I've got turkeys on my property in the winter, if you'd like to send your trapping crew in here to trap them and put, you know, GPS units on them or whatever, that's great. That's how I would answer that question. Try to identify, you know, areas around these study sites, because we run into kind of a problem with these study sites is they have to be huge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're looking to put our hands on 50 to 75 birds per site, and we cover, you know, 100 square miles, let's say. So we need a lot of property and we need a lot of birds, and you catch a very small percentage of what you think you'd catch. So if you think you've got 40 birds on your property, if we caught 20 of them, we'd be doing something special. So it takes a lot of area and it takes a lot of birds to pull these studies off.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. This is going back to the presentation. Any thoughts on mechanisms that have resulted in the shift in incubation to later in the year?
Yeah. What I think is going on, I think there's several things involved there. One, I think that collectively, if you look across the areas that I work in, we have lost tens of thousands of acres of hardwood forest. And those forests have been replaced by either pine dominated forest or infrastructure. We've built on those areas. And if we have allowed the stands to regenerate in the hardwoods, they're young. They're not, they were clear cut, say 20 years ago. And those oaks are not producing a lot of mast, if any. And people listening to this can probably go to a spot that looks like this. Imagine a hardwood forest that was clear cut 25 years ago. All the trees are about the same size. It's a wasteland under it. There's no understory, and you don't see a lot of activity of anything in there. And we have a lot of that in the Southeast. That's one, because what that's doing is it's pushing birds into the fall and winter and having them come into the reproductive season lighter than they were historically. They don't have as much fat on their breast. They're not storing as much fat on their body, and they're not as fit, if you will. The other thing that I think is ongoing is I think that we're disturbing the breeding process in some areas. And what's happening, and our data very clearly show this, that you have this onset of nesting that ramps up, and then there's disturbance associated, particularly with the early season openers. And instead of the bird having a bell curve where the nesting peaks and then drops, which is what it's supposed to look like, it has those long tails. So we have birds that are laying their first clutch in May, and some birds that are laying their first clutch at the beginning of April. And then if they lose their first clutch, they're laying a second clutch in, say, June. As an aside, and that's not a popular answer, but you asked me a question, so I'll give you an honest answer. On the site we're studying that is not hunted at all, a 200,000 acre site, we see a perfect bell curve where nesting ramps up and is done in 60 days. It doesn't have that long tail. We only see that long tail on the sites where, public sites in particular, they're heavily hunted. Now, I'm not saying every site in the United States looks like that, but I think we are seeing some disturbance early in the reproductive season that's causing that kind of delay that's pushing that tail out there. And that's why there's actually quite a bit of research that we're looking at this in a lot of our different sites, and we see the same trends for the most part.
Well, like you said, it's like probably not the most popular answer, as you alluded to, but I, especially like we talked about the kind of the rallying of turkey hunters behind this science, as we've seen, I have, even if it's not the best news, even if it's some folks that don't want to hear, I do have faith in our overall hunting community that it will be taken, correctly. I think overall we want to do what's best for the resource. I would like to
Sure.
think.
Well, think about it this way. And this, I'm not asking people to just accept what I say at blind faith, but think about it this way. So you're a hen and you've selected this tom that's the best tom, and you breed with him multiple times, and your body is adapted to breed with him even while you're laying. So you've started laying a clutch, but you're still breeding, you're still copulating, and you're still storing sperm. Think about a scenario where you work through this and you've picked that tom and you've bred with him once, and then he disappears. And if you're a hen, what are you going to do? You're not just going to breed with the next tom. That's not how sexual selection works. There's a reason that these birds are gaudy and they look the way that they are. They have strong sexual selection. And there are toms that are better than others, and that's the birds that hens select. So research on other species that have the same mating system has shown clearly that if you go in and you pick these better birds out early, it causes everybody to slow down. And that kind of, I mean, it makes sense from a hen's perspective if you think about it. Wait a minute. That guy that I was really, he was my breeder, he's gone. So I'm going to step back a few days and kind of think, work through things and see how this works out. Well, a few days is what you see in that figure. If you look across a group of hens that are in a breeding group, a few days is what causes that April, May. That's a few days across a group of 6 or 8 birds. That's over a month. So I think there's a lot of validity to that. And again, it's really hard to show in turkeys because we can't see them largely, and we can't just go in and kill them experimentally. Although we're getting close to this on a site. We're working out some details where we'll be able to mark the toms and then go in and remove birds that we believe are dominant birds based on what we're seeing. But in other species like prairie chickens that function very similar to turkeys, the research is very clear. You can see the birds, so you can go out and say, oh, there's 2 dominant birds on the lek. Let's pluck those 2 out of there and see what happens. That work is pretty clear. That's my hypothesis, and it is just that. It's a hypothesis.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. Trying to cover it. We're trying to cover as many questions as we can. So this next one is revolving around pretty much all the talk that you hear around population declines. It's mainly focused on Easterns and the Southeast is what you hear. And so this question here is wondering if there's any research looking into Rio or Merriam populations, or if there's any concern there.
Yes, good question. There's actually, if you look across the last few years, Nebraska has made regulations changes. Kansas has made regulations changes that includes Rios. Nebraska made changes this year, reduced the bag limit, changed the non-resident tagged sales. Oklahoma dropped their bag limit. All of those states did that because of severe concerns over population declines in those states. When you get to a state agency that reduces a bag limit to 1, that is a call, because what they're saying is, we're not going to allow you to kill but one of these birds. A bag limit of 1 in anything should be a prompt to us to pay attention. If you're a deer hunter or duck hunter or any other kind of hunter, and you are told your bag limit is 1 for the year, 1 shot, 1 bird, you're done, that should tell you something. So what you've seen is there's a large project in Oklahoma, there's a large project starting in Kansas, and there's a huge project that just started in Nebraska that I'm involved with. And that just speaks volumes to what you're seeing. This is not a Southeastern problem. This is extended into many other areas. Ohio, same thing. They made a regulations change based on a number of years of declines. So this is not just a Southeastern problem. This is extended to many parts of the species range.
This one, it's kind of related to the same, but so I'm just going to read it straight off. Is it fair to say that the North is behind the South? Will we see a decline? It seems like we're in the best years now. He's asking if he wants to start studying northern birds. Some of this you covered just that last question. But it is interesting because, as you said earlier, there's some people that I talked to today that I traveled, and I guess they're in certain pockets. They're like, we don't see there's no decline where we're at. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are some states that, you talk to people and they're like, hey, I don't see a problem. And a lot of those states are in the Northeast. I will say that, and some of this could just be social media driven. I didn't get questions about any states in the, Wisconsin, Michigan, New York, Vermont, Maine, any of those states ever. But the last 2 years, I have fielded a number of questions from people in both Wisconsin and in New York about, hey, I live in an area, I'm an outfitter, and I usually guide pick a number, 40 hunters per year, and I've cut my hunters to 20. In fact, I had a person that emailed me recently that said they've suspended they stopped taking hunters in their area in Wisconsin because they're concerned about the numbers. A close friend of mine who's an agency biologist has said this in a number of meetings, and it's not a popular sentiment, but he has said openly, if you don't see a problem where you are, just wait. And I think some of that is largely true, because you have to understand that when we restored birds, we were doing it at different times. So some states were way ahead of other states. And I think what you're seeing is in some states, they're reaching their historic peak, and maybe they haven't started to decline, and maybe they will not. I don't know. I hope not. I hope that some states will be spared. And I think probably you'll see examples where you don't encounter issues because there's not a tremendous demand for birds in those states. Maybe there are not a lot of dramatic changes to land use. I'm kind of thinking about some Western states where there's a lot of large private lands. Texas is a good example. Texas has not seen with Rios, they have not seen the dramatic declines in most of the state that we've seen in Rios in, say, Oklahoma or Kansas. And I suspect that's largely driven around these large private lands that are just, we've shown this, we've banded thousands and thousands of Rios, and harvest rates are really, really low, less than 5%, meaning less than 5% of the toms are shot each year. Incredibly low harvest rates on average, not on a given property, but on average across the state. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think you're probably going to see some states that kind of plateau out and come down, but maybe with all of the discussion and all of the attention and everything we're putting out there, maybe some of those states have enough people that will think proactively and go, you know what, I don't want to be Arkansas. I don't want to be Alabama. I don't want to be Georgia. I want to get ahead of this. And I'd love to see some states do that are seeing, these really high populations that seem to be doing well. Let's get out in front of it.
Right. We'll go one more question and then we'll close the evening out. Before I do that, we are doing a t-shirt giveaway. You can find the link for that in the chat box. And again, all this information will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. We've maintained most of the people that logged in have stayed on for this entire thing. That tells me that they're very interested in what you're saying. So before we address a final question, so to speak, Dr. Chamberlain, where can people go to see the results of the research that you're doing to kind of stay in tune with this? Because even from my perspective, I see more people wanting to read and know turkey literature and science more than I ever have. So how can people keep up with you?
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously follow me on social media. I don't put heavy sciencey stuff out on my platforms, but if you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, I do post a lot about turkeys on those accounts.
Turkey Tuesdays is one of my favorite things that you do. It's always, I'm serious. I'm not blowing smoke. Like, it's always interesting information.
It's fun too. It's fun doing it. I like seeing people's reactions to it. We actually just launched a website it's in its infancy, but it's wildturkeylab.com. And it's sponsored by Mossy Oak, and we're going to use that website to put all of the information I can possibly put out there for people in an easily digestible manner. It's again, it's in its infancy, so it doesn't look like it's going to look. It's going to change by the day, but it's out there, and we're going to start building it. If you go there, you'll see scientific research articles. You'll see all my Turkey Tuesday posts. You'll see I'm going to actually create a tab that has all of the history of turkey research, what's been done, who are the people that came before me, what does it mean, what did they do, and what does it mean to you? That's what I want people to get. Everything is in easy, layman terms. I'm trying to, what did this work do? What did they find? What does it mean? And why should you care? That's what that site is about. And it's going to be a permanent archive for everything I've done and all the content I can put up there. but the content is driven by me. So it's not going to change, rapidly overnight. It's something you'll have to check back with, but we're constantly putting content out there. And I think I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be cool.
I love it. I love that it's happening. I think it's just, like I said, these sources are so there's such a demand for them now, and that excites me. It's got to excite somebody like you that has worked in this field for so long. I think we can tie this up here. You've given us a lot of your time. You've given us a lot of information. Dr. Chamberlain, thank you. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for the work you've done for wild turkeys.
Yeah, no problem, man. It's good being with you. I'm glad to do these types of things. I appreciate interacting with people and answering questions best I can.
Likewise. All right, guys, we're going to sign off. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. Again, don't fret if you missed some of it. We'll email it out. It'll be on the onX YouTube channel. And we'll see y'all next time. Thank y'all.